Good morning, women of Silicon Valley. Sam Wallace here. As announced, I'm absolutely delighted to be joining you all this morning. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I'd hoped to be in the room to share a little bit more of a real-time exchange, but looking forward to sharing this presentation with you and hopefully having some interesting Q&A live through the chat at the end of this session. What I would say is, as I'm presenting in this format, if there are things that come up that you want to ask a question about, drop them in the chat and we can pick them up at the final end of this session. We've got 10 minutes booked for Q&A. So let me start with this. The question that I'm asking has been presented for years and years, right? Why do we not see more women in the executive suite, at the board level, and in senior leadership roles? And what's interesting about this question is it's been answered in many different ways over many, many years. And some of that data suggests that, in fact, having women in these roles is incredibly advantageous to organizations. It drives better profit, it drives better performance, it creates a slightly different culture, the way that organizations operate. And so the net is that adding more females in the executive levels of organizations is ultimately beneficial. And what we've seen in the last many years are these incremental increases at that very senior level. And these are celebrated widely and loudly. And in some respects, maybe they should be. Every success drives us towards the goal that we're seeking, which is greater equity in the senior roles. It's greater representation for women at the executive level. But the challenge I have with that is that every small step we take is just that. It's a small step. And we have to take these steps, absolutely. And if we stop being resilient and we stop pushing to see that change happen, it won't happen. But I think we have to look at the numbers and take a really hard look at them to say, is it good enough? Is what we're doing achieving what we need it to? And if it's not, which I would argue that it's not, what are we doing to change that? How can we all actively change the way that we think about supporting women, getting women into those senior roles? I would argue this is applicable across many aspects of diversity, but for this particular topic, I really want to focus on women. That's data that's been studied for a long time. It's metrics that we have. And when you look at this, I'm going to share my screen now. When you look at this information and sit with it for a minute, it should give us pause for thought. This data tells us that we have seen some increases in gender representation in the Fortune 500, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. It's been tracked for many years. We go back to 2002. In 2002, there were 7 women who were CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, just 7. And over the years, we have seen incremental increases. Now, of course, this is fluid. The same people who are in the positions at 2002 are not the same ones as are there in 2022, of course. But the overall numbers, we've seen incremental changes. In 2021, in fact, we saw a world-breaking record of 41 female CEOs in the Fortune 500. Astonishing and to be celebrated. And then we saw a very significant leap, relatively speaking, into 2022, where now, today, as of March 2022, we have 71 female CEOs in the Fortune 500, 71. So lots of numbers to sit with here for a second. 71 women out of 500 potential roles. So 429 men, 71 women. Think on that for a second. Then let's maybe pull the data back. So if we look between 2002 and 2022, and we take an average, let's say, of how many new female CEOs are being appointed on average per year, 3.2 per year. Now that's skewed, obviously. 2022 to 2021, we saw a bump. But even at this pace of change, even with the increase that we've seen in 2022, we are still years and years and years away from equity in terms of female representation in the Fortune 500, let alone having more women in those seats of power. But this is just one view. This is the Fortune 500 CEOs. What if we take a look at another perspective? Let's take a look at the S&P 1500. So this data I found absolutely fascinating. Say hello to John. Johns represent 5.3% of all CEOs in the S&P 1500. Just people named John. Who do you think is next? Thoughtful looking young man, David. There are 4.5% of the S&P 1500 named David. Johns and Davids make up nearly 10% of the entire S&P 1500. And then all women, every single female in the S&P 1500 from A to Z represents 4.1% of the entire population. Hot on their heels, don't forget Robert, he's down at 3.9. Again, we'll pause on that, think on that for a second. There are more Johns and Davids in senior executive leadership roles than there are the entire population of women. Let's step back maybe. Let's take a look at smaller organizations. So let's take a look at what's driving the future, driving innovation, driving R&D, bringing new ideas to life. It's the entrepreneurs, it's the startups, it's that venture fund, it's that PE fund that are providing wealth to new ideas that are shaping our future. Last year, there was $329.9 billion invested from VC funds. That's a huge number. Anybody have a guess? If I was in the room, anybody have a guess at how much of that was invested in female founders? 50% maybe? 25%? Show of hands. 10%? 5%? 2% of that $329.9 billion was invested in female-founded organizations. Now, there is a lot of literature on why that is. Venture funds like aggressive plans. They like plans that will see a close. They like the way that men operate in these businesses. And I just don't think that that is true. I think that we are seeing patterns of behavior which are skewed to historic ways of doing things. And I think that the way women and the way that we're approaching these things is allowing that to continue. And so through the rest of this presentation, what I want to do, in addition to talking a little bit more about some of the facts that I think influence this, is examine how some industries can support this imbalance, how executive search in particular has had a role to play, and I would say is culpable for some of the imbalance at the top of the house, but can make a positive difference. And with your involvement and relationships in that ecosystem, you can also make a positive difference. And I think that's what I'm hoping the takeaway will be from this presentation, is to say, when we look back at these numbers and we look at more Davids than women in the S&P 1500, or we look at a plus 64 over the course of 20 years for Fortune 500 CEOs, or we look at 2% investment from a $329 billion pot in female founders, we'll look back and say, you know what? Progress is great. It's not fast enough. It's not aggressive enough. And of the levers that we can pull, the things that we can control and the things that we have influence over, these are the things we take control of, and we can actually make a difference. So with that, I guess here's the question: why is somebody who is in executive search, and I do retained work in executive roles in the tech space, Why is somebody who's in executive search coming to this forum to have this conversation? Well, I think it's important just to start with the baseline to understand the size and the scale and the impact of the executive search industry and some of the challenges there within. Executive search industry is over a $14 billion industry. Most senior roles, executive and board level roles, are now presented to executive search firms to work on. They are often competitive situations where there are multiple firms that come in to bid on a search. And it might be the CEO, it might be a succession plan, it might be a non-executive director, but these positions are being managed through this multi-billion-dollar industry. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves is, how of these firms in this multi-billion-dollar industry, how are they selected? So maybe think back to an appointment that was made in your organization when the new CEO perhaps was appointed, or a new COO, CFO, CTO, you name it. When they were appointed, what was the criteria upon which the executive search team firm that was ultimately selected, what was the criteria against which they were selected? Was it network? Was it cost? Was it market knowledge? Was it that they were referred in by an influential member of the board, and so that trusted buddy was the person who came in to do the work? May even be speed to hire. You know, in fact, it's all of those things. All of those things influence how a search firm is selected. And depending on the order of importance of those things, depends how much bias comes into the process itself. So here, I want to tell you just a quick story, and then I'll hopefully this will add a little bit of color to things. So network, market knowledge, relationship, cultural understanding, they're all incredibly important. And I think that the dynamic that anyone has with their potential partner through a search process is critical to success. I recently was in a competitive situation where I was bidding for a chief commercial officer for a two-sided marketplace, doing really amazing work, driving government procurement decisions into underrepresented minorities. So firms that were led by underrepresented minorities and helping governments use their spend in a more equitable way. Awesome organization, secured a really significant amount of funding recently, and so they're up leveling to what they're doing. I worked with them many years ago, and I had put in one of their senior product leaders. I've stayed very close to the business to see them go through these kind of growing pains of an early startup company and know them well, understand their culture, understand two-sided marketplaces, understand the government space, have not done exactly this role in that space. So I do not have an immediate network of chief commercial officers to go to that match exactly that spec. We lost that search to another search firm, and my client was very transparent, explained why, because he, the search partner, came to my client and said he had just placed the guy at an exact same organization. So his network was representative, full of the guys that he had just placed and had in his shortlist for this other organization. So I come back to my question with that observation, which is this: what does your network look like? What do networks look like? If the power of a search firm is the power of their network and the knowledge they have about an industry segment, what does that look like in the search industry? Reflect on that for a second. What does your network look like? It's what I'm going to say. I can't see the room. I'm assuming it's 95% women in this room, all of whom are at director and senior level positions. And I would bet that the vast majority of our most influential leaders in our network are not dissimilar to us, whether it's age, whether it's gender, whether it's industry segment. We're going to see our networks look and feel a little bit like us. So what I can tell you, statistically reported that 63% of the exec search industry is white. I don't have exact data on what percentage of the executive search industry in technology in particular are men. I will tell you anecdotally that if I were to put a number on it, I would say 75 to 85% of the exec search industry that focus on technology are male. The reason this is important is because if we build our networks with people who look and seem and feel like us, and the industry in exec search is skewed towards a gender imbalance, there's a natural sort of perpetuation of what we're seeing at the top of the house, in the executive suite and at the board level. Let me back this up with a little bit more data for you. So we have recently conducted a longitudinal study to say, how do we attract diverse candidates into a process? And in order to explain this, I'll give you a little bit of a data point. So when a new engagement is launched, the client gives you the brief from an executive search perspective, and then you do what you call is market mapping. You define the target talent community, the likely organizations that they'll be from, and you identify the people who will most likely be target individuals to network with. So they may not be candidates, they may be sources, but there's a population, there's a community that you build, a conceptual community that are the targets for any given search. So through this longitudinal study, we've been measuring, when we're targeting those communities, how many times do we have to make contact with an individual in order to engage them in a conversation, in order to encourage them maybe to look at a new job description, in order to explore the validity of their potential background for the role that we're in the market for. And then ultimately, how many points of contact does it take to get them from that point of initial engagement through to an interview with the client and then real consideration of career change? And what we found, and this is a really fascinating data point, what we found is it takes 1/3, get that, 1/3 more interactions with female candidates to get them from the first point of contact through to a close than it does male candidates. So let's kind of pull that back. What does that mean? So when you've been contacted by somebody in executive search and they send you a message on LinkedIn, or you get that phone call, that number that pops up on your phone that you don't know the number, so you don't answer. If that happens over the course of 2 weeks, whilst a search consultant is in pursuit of a conversation with you, and it takes you 2 weeks to engage, in that same amount of time, a non-diverse candidate may have taken the first call, happened to see a number they didn't know, thought they'd be curious to see who it was, picked up the call the first day of the search. By the time you started to begin thinking about engaging with the search firm, whether just to take the call or respond to the LinkedIn message or the email, that non-diverse candidate has already gone through several rounds of assessment with the executive search firm. They've likely been socialized to the executive partners within the client organization, maybe as a calibration. So they're already several steps ahead in the process because it's taken us as women longer to get to that point. Now, it could be because we've got more family commitments. Again, there's a lot of data in and around women having the second job, particularly through the pandemic, that they have their executive role as well as their household role. Maybe that's what it is. Or maybe it's that it's intense in their current role. They don't have space or time to think about a what if in a conceptual way about something that they hadn't really thought about before. Or maybe it's, who knows? Any number of reasons, but we've got the data that suggests it does take that many more interactions. So that puts us a little bit behind where some of the male candidates are. So I say all of this because I think if we bring that forward in our consciousness, then we can really start to think about, how do we build pipelines when we're the hiring manager? How do we think about that type of engagement, whether it's with recruiters, whether it's with executive search, whether it's potentially with hiring managers? how do we think about that engagement to say, it's an investment of time that I need to make now that may pay dividends in the short term or may pay dividends in a much, much longer time frame. And I think these are really important things that we have to think about, because if we invest and we build in those relationships, then we start to really feel the benefit and be able to move that forward as we think about our career progression. I recognize that I'm running out of time here, so I do want to bring just a couple of other points to the fore. Firms, your firm is probably one of them, are looking for their client partners to be representative of diversity. So if we are skewed white and we are skewed male in the executive search space, then when you potentially as a hiring manager or you as a candidate are looking at search firms to engage with, look at the representation within their search team. Find the firms that are building networks and proactively building networks of women, because that will accelerate the path to building that spider web, to being given access to those roles, and then be open-minded to having the conversation when you didn't mean to, you didn't expect to, and you really didn't want to, but it might be interesting. I'll leave you with this, a final screen share here. In 2015, RBG was asked, when will there be enough women in the Supreme Court? I'm sure you can all remember this. She said, there'll be enough when there are 9. I'll leave you with that. I truly appreciate the time. Please pop your questions in the chat, and I'm on the app. So if there's an opportunity to have a conversation throughout the conference, I certainly would welcome it. Thanks so much. I appreciate your time.